Right, we're on the air, and
So, Max, can I just check that I can share my screen? Have I got that right to do so?
I have enabled that. So, yes, please feel free to share your screen now. I'll give you a brief introduction and then throw to you. Great. Yes, we're seeing that. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this ESAANZ seminar, France, Australia, Rapprochement, question mark. We're very lucky to have Dr. Elizabeth Rechniewski of the University of Sydney and Dr. Romain Fati of Flinders University of South Australia. And they're each going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then I think we'll have questions and discussion at the end. The seminar was originally advertised to run from 5 till 7, but we think it likely that till 6:30 would be an elegant sufficiency.
Yes.
So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Rechniewski, and she is an honorary senior lecturer at the University of Sydney and chief investigator on an ARC discovery project judging the past in a post-Cold War world, and a great interest in French history and indeed the history of French-Australian relations. And her paper is entitled French-Australia Relations, Le poids de l'histoire, the weight of history. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much indeed for this opportunity. Okay, so inspired by this quote from well-known historian Robert Darnton, my aim today is to clothe the event that was the AUKUS announcement of last September in the attitudes, values, frames of mind, recollections of the past, and projections of the future, full of passion, hope, and fear. And I'm going to begin by showing you, okay, it's not working. Going to begin simply by a reminder of how extensive the French presence in the Indo-Pacific is. This confetti of empire extends from Mayotte off the east coast of Africa, south to the Terre Adèle in Antarctica, and across the vast Pacific Ocean, taking in New Caledonia, Wallis and Futuna, French Polynesia, along the way to reach the uninhabited island of Clipperton off the west coast of America, giving France the second largest exclusive economic zone in the world and the basis for the potential projection of its power in the region. And there, right in the middle, straddling the two oceans, is Australia, long a bastion of British imperial fidelity. Today, I'll talk mostly about the Pacific, and in the first half, looking back briefly, very briefly, at the history between the two nations in this region, and in the second half, trying to tackle the question in the title, Rapprochement. With customary diplomatic tact, the preamble to the 2012 joint statement of strategic partnership between France and Australia cited their 170 years of unbroken friendship, sentiments repeated in 2017 on the signing of the joint enhanced statement of strategic partnership. Absent the diplomatic niceties, however, history records not unbroken friendship, but a turbulent relationship punctuated by periods of high tension when on 4 occasions since World War II, consuls or ambassadors were expelled or recalled. And notably on each occasion, events in the Pacific precipitated the crises, revealing the policy conflicts that have dogged French-Australian relations in this region. I'm going to use those crises as a way into very briefly revealing the underlying tensions in this relationship. And you can see in the table in red the occasions when there were diplomatic recalls or expulsion of ambassadors. Actually, this diplomatic lens is also useful because it reveals the importance of that relationship. The first foreign diplomatic presence established in Australia was the French consulate in Sydney in 1842, established by Louis Philippe, who was convinced that Sydney would be the political and commercial hub of the Pacific. And Consul Pharamond took up his post at the time of the Pritchard Affair, when French troops were fighting in Tahiti to force a protectorate on the territory, exacerbating, although Britain did not intervene, tension between the imperial powers, a reminder not only of imperial rivalry, but of that between missionary ministries. When France took over New Caledonia in 1853, Australia's eastern colonies considered their security under threat, initially from the French themselves, those swarms of the mustachioed sons of Gaul who might swarm down in a few days into Moreton Bay, while other papers speculated that this move must be part of a larger strategy, a design for French control of the Pacific. Later, the threat would be said to come from Russians or from the thousands of Japanese workers employed in the nickel mines, or the islands might be stepping stones for the invasion of the dark forces massing to the east. The New Hebrides, loosely governed by the Anglo-French Naval Commission from 1887 to 1906, when it became the Franco-British Condominium, contributed to Australian security concerns and sub-imperial ambitions, and was among the important factors inciting federation. In fact, anecdote of history, Australia's first spy, William Le Couteur, was sent to collect information on the French settlers and to explore the prospects for a takeover by Britain in 1901. Let's note the schizophrenia in Australia's attitudes towards France in the early 20th century. As Alexis Bergance's French Connection has recently shown, from the 1880s to World War I, Francophilia was at its height in social, cultural, and intellectual Australian life. But on a geopolitical level, French occupation of Pacific Islands was widely viewed by the press and politicians, and at times of particular tension by the wider public, with hostility and suspicion. And despite being wartime allies, the security issue continued to preoccupy the Australian press and parliament in the 1920s and 30s. France had its own concerns. To the initial imperial rivalry with Britain was added the suspicion that the new nation of Australia would act as Britain's stalking horse in the Pacific, and indeed had its own imperial ambitions. The influential French colonial lobby accused the new nation of seeking to impose a third imperialism, a Monroe doctrine of its own. And indeed, Billy Hughes called for such a doctrine, an Australian Monroe doctrine, for the South Pacific in speeches at home and abroad at the end of the war. Hence the accusation that crosses the decades, a similar refrain from the more strident French critics of Australian policy, that really the aim is to create an American or an Anglo-Saxon or an Australian lake. And you remember that in World War II, in August 1940, Australia helped to install the pro-free French governor, Henri Soto, in New Caledonia. And during the war, the territory's economy and society became closely integrated into the Australian sphere. And in fact, this interference was viewed with some concern by the Free French authorities, who feared increased regional integration might pose a threat to French sovereignty. And this opposition to regional integration is also going to cross the decades post-World War II. By the 1960s, there were, in addition to the underlying tensions over security and latent competition over Anglo-Saxon or French influence, three major issues that complicated Australia's relationship with France in the Pacific. And I'm leaving aside the trade issue, Cairns Group, for now. Firstly, the independence of many Pacific Island territories and the founding of the South Pacific Forum in 1971, of which Australia was a member. This saw the new nations push for the independence of other Pacific nations, colonies, with Australia operating a balancing act between support for and sometimes moderation of these demands. Secondly, the start of nuclear testing in Polynesia in 1966, And opposition to the test grew steadily in Australia and the region, not least because France continued with atmospheric testing after other nuclear countries, except China, had signed the Test Ban Treaty of 1963, banning above-ground tests. It continued till 1974, in fact, in France, for the French ones. Thirdly, the Kanak Awakening of 1969 and the founding of the Foulard Rouge, which led to increasing confrontation between settlers and Kanaks and judicial repression of demonstrations that were in favour of greater autonomy. So France and Australia faced complex issues negotiating their relationship in the Pacific post-World War II. Australia was torn between its desire to play a leading role in the region and on the other hand, upholding the political and military alliances with other Western countries, including France, in a Cold War context. Moreover, Australian governments came under possibly unwelcome pressure from their own population, for example, to oppose nuclear testing more strongly. And in the case of Labour governments, pressure from the party and the unions to show greater support for Kanak independence. France faced its own internal pressures and critiques, notably a population sometimes overlooked in accounts of tensions between France and Australia, the Caldoche on New Caledonia, a population that, like other settler communities, defended its interests not only against the indigenous population, but against the metropolitan government when it considered the latter insufficiently responsive to its concerns. And my own recent research has focused on the pressure that loyalists in New Caledonia were able to exert at certain pivotal moments to force the expulsion of the Australian consuls, for example. Long-standing latent representations resurfaced at each crisis. France was accused of arrogance and ignoring the concerns of its Pacific neighbours over testing. France accused Australia of interference in internal French affairs, of hypocrisy in condemning France for its treatment of its indigenous people while its own peoples were in such a powerless state, and of a marked preference for its Anglo-Saxon allies. These tropes provided the vocabulary through which to interpret and criticise the other's actions, a process that Moscovici labelled anchoring. The first post-war diplomatic crisis was in March 1972, when the Australian consul to New Caledonia, Alan Edwards, was recalled at the suggestion of the French government. The official reason was simply interference in internal affairs, but an article published in the loyalist Journal Calédonien titled Monsieur Edwards, Australian Consul or Propagandist for Autonomy was more specific. Published a month before the expulsion, it was cited by Australian sources as precipitating it. Edwards was accused of advocating autonomy for New Caledonia, for suggesting the involvement of the UN in New Caledonian affairs, and above all, Australia was condemned as the tool of British ambition since, and this was the climax of the article, the grand dream of Great Britain is the creation of a Commonwealth of the Pacific through the intermediary of Australia. Fast forward to the 1980s, a new period of escalation. By 1981, both major Australian political parties expected, and in the case of Labour, strongly argued for the independence of the French Pacific territories. Interestingly, it's always really been New Caledonia that's been the focus, but we could talk about that another time. A series of events envenomed relations, in particular, again, I've just put in bold the most crucial ones, the sinking of the Rainbow Warrior, the signing of the Rarotonga Treaty for the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone, and in December 1986, New Caledonia was reinscribed on the UN list of non-self-governing territories in a vote co-sponsored by Australia that infuriated France. And throughout this period, as you can see quickly here, ad hominem attacks proliferated between leaders and culminated in January 1987, when the Australian Consul General, John Dowth, was given 1 month's notice of expulsion. He was accused of, amongst other things, of clandestine meetings with Kanak independence leaders. And it seems likely that, well, for a start, it was Caldoche informers, and it was probably inaccurate and exaggerated. On this occasion, too, a series of accusations was made against Australia of interference, of double dealing, past master in the art of changing sides. This would almost have been written on the occasion of the AUKUS announcement. And the accusation of arrogance is being turned against Australia this time, which of course is part of the va-et-vient of those accusations. A brief lull after the return of a socialist government and the Matignon Agreement of 1988 that was warmly welcomed by the Australian government. Hawke was invited to visit New Caledonia in 1990, the first by a serving Australian Prime Minister since Menzies in 1941. The moratorium on nuclear tests announced by Mitterrand in 1992 further warmed relations. But then in June 1995, newly elected President Jacques Chirac announced the recommencement of testing. And now we're in the area which I'm sure most of us will remember, society-wide protests, an arson attack on the French consulate in Perth, widespread boycotts of French firms, the exclusion of a French company from a major defense contract, and all led to France recalling its ambassador, Dominique Girard, in August 1995. Ivan Barker and Colin Nettlebeck have written that arguably the 30 years until the cessation of the nuclear tests in 1996 were the most traumatic period in the history of French-Australian relations. And this is only 6 years ago. With the end of testing and the signing of the Noumea Accords in 1998 that removed immediate dependence from the agenda, French-Australian relations rapidly improved. In fact, from 1996 to 2021, the political, diplomatic and cultural relations between France and Australia were arguably the closest they'd ever been in peacetime. The submarine contract of 2016 was followed by initiatives to enhance collaboration in many fields, notably in the Indo-Pacific region. The Australian policy to step up in the Pacific was mirrored by the declarations of Emmanuel Macron, naming the Indo-Pacific region as at the heart of France's vision of a stable, law-based, multipolar order, and Australia as a strategic partner in this goal. Macron appointed France's first envoy to the Indo-Pacific, Christophe Penaud, in October 2020. One of his priorities to develop new initiatives, such as the trilateral dialogue launched with India and Australia in September 2020. And when Macron appointed the new ambassador to Australia, Jean-Pierre Thébault, he urged him to be ambitious in expanding the relationship. There are to be no limits. Moreover, France, with Germany, has been a prime mover in encouraging the EU to develop its policies and presence in the Indo-Pacific towards strategic autonomy, leading notably to the joint communication on EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific on the 16th of September 2021, and the appointment in the same month of Gabriel Byzantin as the EU Special Envoy to the Indo-Pacific. And then the AUKUS announcement, the coup de Trafalgar, as a couple of papers headlined it. It threw into the air the French Indo-Pacific strategy carefully crafted by Macron, which included the partnership with Australia as part of its policy of effective multilateralism. That's a key expression that was repeated again in Macron's speech a few days ago. Instead, Australia had realigned itself with the US in, said Morrison, a forever partnership, and had sought submarines that were capable of long-range operations clearly aimed at China. And note that recently Richard Marles spoke of US and Australian forces being not only interoperable, but interchangeable. The two forces could then operate seamlessly together at speed. That the agreement, the AUKUS agreement, involved the three Anglo-Saxon powers may have aroused old suspicions of the ambition to create an Anglo-Saxon lake, in which the French presence was considered at best an irrelevance, at worst a problem, or even an intrusion. the French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian denounced a stab in the back and expressed his surprise at the exclusion of France from the partnership in favor of the traditional allies. It led to the recall of the French ambassador, the latest in the series of diplomatic crises that this paper has catalogued. AUKUS has forced France to recalibrate its Indo-Pacific policy. In February 2022, it issued a major policy document, France's Indo-Pacific strategy. In the chapter on strategic partnerships, there is a section titled Partnership with India, another partnership with Japan, but Australia has been relegated to other bilateral partnerships and is the object of a bitter paragraph. This is February, it's a few months after the announcement, but nevertheless, in the document, there's a reference to, without prior consultation or warning, to break off the partnership of trust with France has led to a re-evaluation of the past strategic partnership. Still under the old government, of course, the old Australian government. The document, the strategy, reaffirms France's commitment to a third path removed from US-China bipolarity by fostering a multipolar order through partnerships with regional middle powers, including India, Japan, and ASEAN. So only a few days after the AUKUS announcement, Macron rang Indian PM Modi to discuss enhancing French-Indian cooperation to act jointly in the Indo-Pacific. And according to one expert today, India is effectively the key partner for France in the Indo-Pacific. France also turned to Indonesia, which is to buy Rafale planes, and France and Japan agreed in January 2022 to enhance cooperation, with talks underway to build a Paris-Delhi-Tokyo trilateral. But the title of this seminar is Rapprochement with a question mark. So I was looking at the reasons for optimism about the development and the restoration of that relationship. The firstly, a new Australian government, which gives France a reason for turning the page on Morrison's treachery. You'll remember the meeting between Albanese and Macron in Paris and the joint statement that says Australia warmly welcomes France's cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, its strategy for further engaging the region, etc., etc. There are also, by the way, reports that Macron will visit Australia at the time of the G20 in November. Thirdly, there's a new French foreign minister, Catherine Colonna, career diplomat, former ambassador to London, because Le Drian had been very closely involved in negotiations for the submarine deal and reacted particularly viscerally to the cancellation. Fourthly, the principal reasons for discord in the past, nuclear testing and Australian support for New Caledonian independence, have been removed. Australia welcomed the result of the second referendum in 2020 and recognised without demur the result of the third one in December 2021, although it was held in the midst of a COVID wave when a boycott by pro-independence parties produced an inevitable landslide to the no camp. And we could perhaps talk about that a bit more in the questions. The new minister, this influential, very well researched book by Paul Sawyer is rather overtaken by events, unfortunately, because it was published in 2019. But despite AUKUS, many of the arguments made by Paul Sawyer of the factors that brought France and Australia to view their interests as mutually empowering are still valid. France and Australia are members of an extensive network of diplomatic, aid and security networks and agreements across the Pacific. For example, we know of the Quad, Australia, India, US, Japan, but there is also the Pacific Quad. France and Australia are part of this less famous Quad for diplomatic coordination in the South Pacific. with America and New Zealand, the Pacific Quad, France, Australia, and New Zealand. Several references are made to this Pacific Quad in France's February 2022 strategy. There are long-standing. Can everyone else hear that noise in the background?
Yes, I think someone needs to be on mute.
Yes, I think Judith, it might be you.
No.
No, you are unmuted.
I think it's Nikki.
Nikki.
All right.
Nikki.
I'll mute. Yep.
Thank
Sorry.
you.
That's all right. Then sixthly, there are long-standing joint military exercises which continue involving France and Australia. So recently, for example, 3 Rafale aircraft flew to New Caledonia. In fact, did it in less than 3 days, which was a record. And they're currently taking part in the biennial Pitch Black military exercises near Darwin with 16 other nations. And France has declared that it is stepping up its military commitment to the Indo-Pacific. Richard Marles has just been in France, where he met his counterpart Sébastien Lecornu for a World War I commemoration at Villers-Bretonneux. Such ceremonies, as Romain would tell us, are always useful for remembering the more positive aspects of the French-Australian relationship. Sébastien Lecornu himself proposed only a few days ago a meeting of Pacific defense ministers and army representatives next year in Noumea, a proposal that signals France's determination to retain its hold on the territory and to take a leading role in enhancing military cooperation there. This is, however, a rapidly evolving situation in a region where optimism on a larger scale is hard to justify. I will close on the words of the French Foreign Minister, Catherine Colonna, in her annual address to French ambassadors given only a few days ago. She said, "Nous devons faire plus dans le Pacifique Sud où se joue un nouveau grand jeu." We must do more in the South Pacific, where a new great game is being played out. Well, we must, you will remember that the last great game, when the British and Russian empires confronted each other across the range of buffer states between them, lasted for most of the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I will stop the recording